Now, we are following a developing story coming in out of New York City. Take a look right here. NYPD now confirming to Live Now from Fox that a man is in critical condition after police responded to a report of a person on fire inside Penn Station. By the way, Penn Station is the busiest transportation facility in the country. The NYPD saying they responded around 8 last night to a man on fire where they found a 67-year-old man with burn injuries to both legs and his upper body. Now, we did learn he was rushed to a hospital with injuries that the fire department says were deemed life-threatening. Police say the investigation is ongoing and no arrests at this point have been made. And of course, you probably are familiar with this case at this point because this comes just days after a sleeping woman was set on fire, burned alive in a Brooklyn subway, killing her. A Brooklyn grand jury indicted Sebastian Zapeta on charges of murder and arson in that case. New York City Mayor Eric Adams has urged the feds to file federal charges against the Guatemalan native who ICE does confirm was in the country illegally. A lot to discuss here, and I do want to talk more about it. So let's bring in Kirk Burkhalter, the criminal law professor there over at New York Law School and a former NYPD detective. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
You're quite welcome.
All right, so first off, the big question here I have to ask you overall, what goes through your mind as you hear about another person being found essentially at a very busy location and they do have burns? Obviously, there's concern there from a lot of people.
Oh, my goodness. A lot goes through my mind. First, personally, I was about 100 yards or so from that very spot yesterday evening. My daughter and I went to a Broadway show and we passed through that corridor, and I pass through that corridor all the time. So it's rather concerning because of the depravity of the act. And unfortunately, this is not something new. We see the homeless victimized all across the country, but in particular in our largest cities quite often. And it seems that it's often for entertainment, setting them on fire and such. It's just a horrible crime. So that's really what runs through my mind, just the depravity of the act of harming someone who is completely helpless and at one of the most vulnerable points of their lives.
And I do want to talk more about the situation with Sebastian Zapeta because we've learned a lot of information over the last week. One thing we don't know, by the way, is the identity of the woman who was killed just yet. NYPD says they are still working to piece that together. But I do want to start with the indictment overall because we saw him indicted yesterday, the Brooklyn district attorney making that announcement. Can we go back to basics? Can you explain exactly what an indictment is?
Certainly. Well, as per the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution, no person can be held answerable for an offense as is framed a infamous or capital offense unless presentment or indictment by a grand jury. So basically, an indictment is where you have a group of impartial citizens who make a determination that there is enough evidence to move forward where the defendant should be formally charged and the matter should move forward to a criminal trial.
Can you break down some of the charges this guy does face? And those are photos that came from his initial court appearance earlier on the week. But we know that there is a murder charge. There's also an arson charge. And what about specific penalties? Because New York does not have the death penalty.
That is correct, yes. So certainly the most significant or serious charge Zapeta is facing at this moment is murder in the first degree under New York state law. And this is very interesting, first because it's rarely charged unless it involves the death of a police officer or first responder. However, within the last month or so, we've seen it charged twice now with Luigi Mangione and now with Zapeta. And he is charged under, this is murder, intentional murder with special circumstances. And he's being charged under the torture subdivision. So when one commits intentional murder, but they do so in a fashion where they torture the victim, meaning they intend and do inflict significant pain, and they do so in a rather depraved manner, meaning that it was debased or defiled, or they derive some form of pleasure from inflicting that torture, that would constitute murder in the first degree. It's pretty much the most serious crime in New York State, and it carries a penalty, a maximum of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole.
One thing that's interesting is you mentioned Luigi Mangione, but we saw federal charges that were filed against him. Now we're hearing from New York City Mayor Eric Adams that he wants to see the feds do the same thing for Sebastian Zapeta. Do you think that is something that could potentially happen?
Well, it certainly could. Whether or not it will, only time will tell. It could because he could be charged with arson and causing serious injury or death of another individual on a facility or a vehicle that's used for interstate transit. And that carries a penalty up to, I believe, 40 years in prison. So he certainly could be charged. It seems that given the level of evidence and this occurred inside the state, quite often the federal authorities will allow the state to prosecute the case first, and then they certainly could prosecute afterwards.
What has stood out to you about this entire investigation? As we gather more details on this, I mentioned this happened last Sunday. We are almost a week out, and we've seen information slowly come in here. So what has stood out to you overall?
Well, first and foremost, the victim, the inability to identify the victim. And this is not because of a lack of effort on the part of the authorities. It is because the victim is likely to be a homeless person themselves. Keep in mind, even with physical evidence such as DNA, prints, and dental records and so forth, those things are very helpful if you have something to compare them to. So if someone doesn't have a DNA sample on file, or dental records on file, or prints on file, there's nothing to compare them to, so there's no way to identify them. So that's the first. And the second is these reports and video that Zapeta fanned the flames and sat and watched. And when we talk about depravity, the level of depravity here, if that is proven, is just off the charts, so to speak. He himself, it seems, has some mental illness issues. However, that's certainly, when one is claims not guilty by reason of insanity, it's not enough that they have these types of issues. It had to be that those issues were such that where the person didn't know right from wrong. And that's a very high hurdle. The more depraved the crime, the more likely is the person has mental issues. But that doesn't mean by any means they will not be held accountable in our criminal justice system.
And one thing that's interesting is in court on Tuesday, the assistant district attorney actually said that during the interrogation, Zapeta said that he didn't remember doing it, but that he does drink a lot of alcohol. But you heard once again from investigators just kind of the depravity of the situation as you're talking about a guy who police say was just sitting by and watching this woman burn to death. It's unimaginable. Now, you obviously are retired from the NYPD. You were there as a detective. Have we seen an uptick in crime in New York City, or are we maybe just hearing about it more?
Very interesting question. I asked one of our DAs here in New York about 2 months ago that very question. He was of the opinion, and I would tend to agree, that generally speaking, crime in New York is down. However, we have these crimes that come to the public's attention that are very sensational, very newsworthy. This assassination of the CEO, these particular deaths. So they do tend to shock the conscience to a certain amount. Generally speaking, the crime against the everyday person that travels public transportation and travels the streets of New York, that is down. However, the big question is, do New Yorkers feel safe? So it's a little difficult to feel safe, even though crime is down, but you see these types of heinous acts occur. You have to keep in mind the police can't be everywhere. We have about 40,000 police officers in New York. You would need about 10 times that amount for a police officer to be on every single corner and every single subway car of New York City. So that's where the difficulty lies.
And what you're looking at right now is a live look over New York City there in Times Square. As we know, the ball drop is just days away, so NYPD presence is going to be very, very heavy there. What about on the subways. The crime on the subways in New York City, has it changed over time? Because so many people ride the subway. There's no question about that. But what is crime like? We heard from Kathy Hochul last weekend. She was criticized because hours after this situation happened, she posted how safe the subways are. So what is crime like there?
Once again, extremely interesting question. Now, I don't want to date myself, but you're talking to someone who grew up in New York and has ridden the public transit system, I don't know, 40, 50 years. So crime on our New York City subways is nothing like it was in the 70s and 80s. That's a fact. However, we did see these historic lows in crime in New York City, basically towards the end of the 90s and further into the 2000s. You saw these amazing reductions. So perhaps we are going backwards some. That is coupled with the proliferation of homeless folks acting out, who are under mental distress in the subway. Are they committing a crime? Well, perhaps not necessarily, but does that make one feel safe? Of course, we saw the controversy with the trial of Daniel Penny against a homeless person who was acting out. So you couple these things together, and it tends to give the appearance that crime is on the uptake and the subways are not as safe, but the statistics show opposite. So the answer to the question really lies with each individual person. How do they feel? When do they travel? What lines do they travel? Are they safer in the outer boroughs or in Midtown Manhattan? It really depends.
All right, going back to Zapeta here, what is next in this case as it does move forward? We know he is scheduled for a next court appearance January 7th. Where does everything go from here?
So now this process will slow down, so to speak. It will take some time. Now that he has been indicted, the defense will receive and all types of discovery, and which means they'll get a crack at the evidence that the prosecution has. There'll be various motions that go back and forth between the parties as to what evidence could be admitted, what evidence could not be admitted. I am certain that Zapeta will be examined by a psychiatrist to determine if he's competent to stand trial. The defense is going to make a decision as to whether or not to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. So you'll have a lot of these pre-trial matters that will play out. We really won't know what direction this is going in for quite a number of months.
All right, Kirk, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here and help discuss this a little bit further. I feel like I could talk to you forever, but I do have to let you go at some point. Anything else you want to add before I let you go?
The only thing I would add is that these crimes, it's as horrible as it is. Folks do have to keep it in context that someone is not being executed like this every single day in New York. We had these outliers with the CEO and here with this person. And as horrible as it is, as a lifelong New Yorker, I can say that New York still is relatively safe. Does New York have issues? Absolutely, 100%. However, relatively safe, and folks have to have the patience to let the criminal justice system play out here.
All right, Kirk Burkhalter, criminal law professor over at New York Law School and former NYPD detective. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us and help break it down. We appreciate it.
You're quite welcome.